Hi, my name is Chris. So today I'm going to be talking about prison and the problems of prison. So prison is a huge debate topic in the United States, especially because there's so much overcrowding and unnecessary imprisonment, especially of minorities. But my major claim today is that mass incarceration negatively affects the United States. One of the first problems is the cost of maintaining the prisoners. The United States has to house the prisoners, and usually that comes from tax dollars. So there's a LA Times put out an article saying that the cost of imprisoning one prisoner is expected to reach a record 75,000 in the next year, and that was publicized in 2017. So that's a huge number. Next is that the prisoners have to get paid for their work, even though it might not be much. The prisons still have to pay for their work, and that's a whole problem in itself. And then also the money that's spent on prisoners, it could be used in other areas, such as education. So in 2012, the United States spent nearly $81 billion in corrections, and spending on those prisons and jails has increased triple the rate that we spend on schools, more specifically pre-kindergarten to 12th grade and public education. My next point is that it affects the future generations of this country. If you're in prison, you won't be able to raise your child. So according to a study conducted by Connecticut State University, 88% of incarcerated fathers rely on their mothers to provide daily care, while 37% of incarcerated mothers rely on their fathers to provide care. 45% rely on the children's grandparents, 23 on friends and relatives, and 11 have to go to foster care. And then also, kids replicate what their parents do. Also in a study conducted by Connecticut University, children of the incarcerated are 3 times as likely as other children without incarcerated parents to be involved in the justice system. And also an article by Christopher Wildman from Yale University, who's in the Department of Sociology, wrote that results imply that mass imprisonment may contribute to a system of stratification in which crime and incarceration are passed down from fathers to sons. My last and final point is that the effects prisoners or mass incarceration affects people who have already served time. So once you've been imprisoned, especially if you have a felony, you can't vote when you get out of prison, which defeats the whole purpose of imprisonment, which is to rehabilitate. Also, former prisoners have a lot of illnesses, whether that be mental or health-wise. So the NAACP put out on their website says that infectious diseases are highly concentrated in correctional facilities. 15% of jail inmates and 22% of prisoners reported having tuberculosis, hepatitis B and C, HIV and AIDS, and other STDs, which is bad if they get released and they're introduced to the general public, and some of them might not tell their spouse or their partner. What the disease they have, and also mental illness. 40% There was a case of a 16-year-old Khalif Browder who endured a psychological trauma after he spent 2 years in solitary confinement, and after being released, he killed himself, which shows that there's a lot of mental illness going on in prisons. And also, former felons don't get hired, which affects the country, as they cannot contribute to society and the economics. So yeah, that's how mass incarceration negatively affects the country.
All right, Christopher, the proposition was clearly identified at the beginning of the speech, but there's not really a layout of what the supporting structure is going to be, so following it is going to be a little problematic unless you have clear labels on the secondary claims. Now, I do know that you have a structure here, but it's not very easy to see, and because of the way that you transition between the evidence, sometimes it sounds like your next piece of evidence is your next supporting point, when in fact it's really just related to the previous supporting point, or occasionally we get a piece of evidence that really does introduce a new supporting point, but there's no distinctive claim for that supporting point. So that's a little bit problematic. You need a much stronger label of the supporting structure in the speech. When we get to the last part of the speech, for instance, it just feels like there's this cascade of random comments about prisons that are negative, which don't necessarily demonstrate any relationship to too many people being incarcerated, but rather problems that exist in prisons that are not necessarily related to the total number of prisoners. Just prisons are not great places for all kinds of reasons. So it feels a little bit like you just randomly reached into a bag and pulled out a whole bunch of things that are unpleasant about prisons, which is not necessarily the thing that demonstrates the point that you were making at the beginning of the speech. There's some information in here that gets cited. You started off pretty well with the LA Times citing the cost of being in prison, how much it costs us to keep a person in prison. There's some factual data about how much total money we spend on prisons. And after that, the information gets a little bit less certain as to where it comes from, especially in this last part of the speech. There was a good quote from somebody, a peniologist, an academic who's looking at prisons and talks about how maybe there's some kind of stratification of the prison population through fathers passing things on to their sons. That's an argument that probably needs a lot more development, because the theory is that it makes it sound like it's a learned behavior as opposed to it's a consequence of the fact that the person is in prison. There could be all kinds of explanations here. Attributing causality in that situation requires a lot more proof than you are providing. There's way too much reading in the presentation. You need to look up and tell us what the argument is. And like I said, the last section especially just feels like it's not particularly organized and just a random collection of insights about prisons. Your argument really needs to focus on how mass incarceration is creating these particular problems. You don't really have an explanation as to what the standard amount of people in prison ought to be, or how many more people we have in prison than ought to be in prison. It doesn't sound like you're suggesting that nobody should be in prison. At least that's not the inference that I'm taking here. But if that is your inference, then you have to justify that a heck of a lot more. But it's, like I said, it's not particularly clear where you would make the trade-off. I guess it's at that $75,000 a person. If they stole more than $75,000, or they killed people that are worth more than $75,000, then they should be in prison. And if they did something less than that, they shouldn't be. I don't know how I'm supposed to make that judgment. The source of the problems needs to be connected to the number of people in the prisons, and that's not always the case. It's, just that prisons are unpleasant places with unpleasant people in them. Okay, thank you.